I worked for the veteran recording in progress. I worked for the Veterans Health Administration for about a decade in various roles, and then recently transitioned to having a private practice here in the Roaring Fork Valley. I have a particular interest in working with caregivers and have run support groups and worked individually with caregivers for about the past 15 years. So I'm hoping that people can ask questions. You know, it's a small group. Please feel free to kind of ask questions throughout, and hopefully it can feel kind of like a conversation as we talk through some of these ideas around caregiver role transitions. So today we're going to talk about let's see if I can change my slide. We're going to talk about the caregiving journey, right? We know that the role of the caregiver changes over time to reflect the needs of the care recipient. So as the care recipient needs various types of support, the role of the caregiver can shift and change and transition. So let's see, I had a quick question here. Oops, wrong way. For the three of you that are on, are any of you currently in a caregiving role? I see a head, a no, I see a maybe. Okay. But yeah, so it certainly sounds like I was talking with Amanda about this before, that sometimes we can do this, we can be in our professional lives, we can be aware of caregiving and we can be supporting caregivers in various ways. And then we may have times in our personal life where we're also become a caregiver or are supporting a caregiver that's in our family or in our social circle. And so often it can be part of our professional and our personal lives. Okay. Okay, so each family's journey into being a caregiver occurs in kind of their own unique context, right? But it can be really helpful to conceptualize it as a series of stages that a caregiver moves through. Because this can help us kind of think about what those roles and responsibilities are going to be along the caregiving journey and what kind of supports might be the most helpful to have. For some people,
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not sure your slides are progressing if you've moved from the first screen.
Okay. It's not. What do we do? Okay, wait. Oh, I wonder. How about now? Nothing?
Nothing yet. Roger is recommending to try unsharing your screen and then resharing it.
Okay, let's try that. Let's do stop share. And then PowerPoint.
Oh, there it is. Awesome.
Okay, wait, and let's try moving it. Yeah.
Yep, we're seeing
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
Okay. Let me know if that happens again. Yeah. So just thinking about what the goal of the talk today is, to review the stages of caregiving and notice kind of what kind of support is needed for the caregiver and the care recipient as they move through those stages. Okay. So here are the stages that a caregiver journey can typically proceed through. And it can start with this role that we don't often talk about or think about, the beginning stages of when somebody's in this kind of pre-caregiver role, through what we typically think of when we think about a family caregiver and how that's clearly a defined role, to what can happen after we move through the loss of a loved one and being in the bereavement stage, to then thinking about how to transition out of that role of caregiver and back into other roles in your personal life. We often hear the most kind of about this caregiver role right in the middle, but it can be really helpful to think about those transitions that happen leading up to that and the transitions that happen after it. And then these roles that are here come from a mix of work of two of my kind of broader colleagues in the field of geropsychology that I have referenced there. I certainly want to recognize their work in kind of thinking about and conceptualizing these roles. Okay, so we'll first start talking about what we think of as like the early stages, right? This pre-caregiver role into where there's a clear onset of illness, and then into what we think of as this kind of like ambiguous caregiver role that can start happening. Okay, so in this stage one, the pre-caregiver role, first I always want to think about that caregiving happens in the context of a relationship, right? There is no caregiver without a care recipient. And so when we think about caregiving, it's important to think about the overall relationship of these two individuals, or sometimes more, right? Depending on how many people in the family or social support circle are providing care for a loved one. So in this first stage of pre-caregiving, right, the older adult and the caregiver are living their own kind of autonomous lives. All right, this might look different depending on the family relationship. This may look like an adult child living in a different state from their parent. Um, at this point, there's little to no concern about the health of the older adult, and there's really no real assistance going on that wasn't maybe already there just naturally in the relationship between the two individuals. So at this point, the older adult is independent. And the reason that this part is included in the stages of caregiving is that the stage is relevant because each family comes into caregiving with their own kind of unique family dynamics, their own histories, and that can lay kind of a template for how the caregiving relationship can unfold. All right, like our history with our loved one, our history with our family certainly can impact how we become a caregiver and how we move through those different roles and transitions. Because when we think about our own families or our own relationships, we know that there's already kind of an established pattern of how we communicate with whether it's with our spouse, whether it's with our parent or a sibling, aunt or uncle. There's already kind of ways that we communicate, ways that we navigate conflict. We may be in a family where there's a lot of open communication about health concerns. There's a lot of open communication about finances. Or we may be in a family situation where finances are not discussed. Healthcare is not discussed. And those sort of aspects of a relationship are really going to come into play when an older adult or older loved one starts needing care. So in this first stage, we think of the struggle, which we'll talk about like kind of with each stage, what is the struggle and what is the goal? This struggle is any long-term issues that were already in the relationship, right? And this can look really different for different families. I've certainly worked with caregivers where there's a history of a loving, caring, supportive relationship, where there is a strong foundation for the relationship already there. Or I've also worked with caregivers where there might be a history of estrangement, which complicates the idea of becoming a caregiver. I've worked with adult children who are caring for a parent who wasn't part of their life when they were growing up, or who maybe was part of their life, but was really struggling and wasn't a healthy part of their life during their childhood or early adulthood. We might also see if there's been a history of, emotional or physical abuse in the relationship prior, that can certainly impact and create challenges in becoming a caregiver in that relationship. So the goals at this stage is to kind of take stock of your family history, your role in the family, and working on kind of prioritizing your own health and wellness and working through or stabilizing aspects of the relationship with your loved one. I realize that for all of us, we might not realize, like, are we in a pre-caregiver stage in our relationship with our loved ones right now? Like, we don't know. Some of us may, if there's already some signs happening, right? But we don't know often at this stage, are we going to be a caregiver or not? Is this going to how is this going to impact my relationship? So at this stage, there's no clear caregiving role yet, and there's no kind of specific caregiver support, but it can be helpful when we have people in our family that we think we may be caregivers for, to have some awareness of that, potentially work on stabilizing that relationship or shifting unhealthy or unhelpful kind of communication patterns there. Okay. So that's kind of the first stage here. And then illness onset, right? This can look really different depending on the type of illness, right? We might have an experience where a loved one has an acute hospitalization, an acute illness, or an acute, cancer diagnosis, clear diagnosis, but often it is more of this slow progression. We think of this when we're thinking of somebody who might be in the early stages of showing cognitive impairment, right? The early stages of showing some signs or symptoms of dementia. We might also see this when somebody is experiencing, slow loss of their vision, slow loss of mobility issues, maybe starting to experience some of the more functional limitations of some illnesses like diabetes, if they're having neuropathy, those types of things. And so often we don't even notice that this is happening because it's such a slow progression, and it's only in hindsight that we see that where those early signs were, when this actually started to happen. And this can be a very confusing time for families to try to understand, is there a problem here? Like what's happening with mom and dad? What's happening with my spouse? What's happening with another older family relative? And how worried should I be? So we think of this stage as the ambiguous caregiver stage. And at this stage, we're starting to notice that there's a medical or mental health condition that's impairing aspects of the older adult's life. But it might not always be really consistent what those aspects are, and it might be really variable here. And so we're starting to see that the older adult needs some assistance with more complex tasks. This may look like seeing oh, when I'm at my mom's house, I'm noticing that she's not opening her mail, and that I'm concerned that maybe she's not paying her bills. Or I'm noticing that my mom is asking for more help with managing her medications or appointments. Or often it's not that they're asking for more help, but that we're noticing that some things aren't going as smoothly as they used to go. It may look like opening your parents' refrigerator and seeing that they really don't have the basic food that they've always had in the home. Or it may look like noticing that they're not paying their bills, or noticing that they haven't filed their taxes on time and they've always been on top of that. So this can be a really confusing time in the relationship with your loved one, because at this point, as the caregiver, the soon-to-be caregiver, you might not be even identifying as a caregiver yet. You might not be thinking, oh yes, I'm definitely a caregiver for my mom or dad or for my spouse. And it can be this real challenge between honoring your loved one's dignity and autonomy, and also starting to maybe notice some safety concerns or concerns that they could be being taken advantage of. So this is when we start to see some changes in the relationship with the caregiver, some role changes happening here. I have kind of an example of what we might see at this stage. So I'll just go ahead and read this description here. Pat's children are avoid riding in his car if he's driving. None of them will let their children ride with him, and all fear getting a call that he's been in an accident. but his car is his lifeline to independence. The nearest town is 10 miles away from his home. So without a car, he would be socially isolated and fully dependent on friends or family. And his family is kind of frozen with fear. They don't know, they're afraid to insist that he stop driving because they worry it could impact his mood. They worry he'll become incredibly isolated. They don't have any system set up for him to have assistance with driving, but they're also really afraid of what might happen if he keeps driving. And so this is that stage of like ambiguity, like, should we step in? How do we step in? Is dad going to let us step in? But they're already choosing to make sure that they're not driving with dad or that their children aren't driving with dad. So here we see that kind of tension between autonomy for their loved one, but also some increasing concerns about safety. Other things that we might see here, is if we see a loved one making really different or poor financial decisions, we might see them spending more money than we know that they might have. They're selling their home or buying a new property, and it doesn't fit in line with how they've always managed their finances or how they've made kind of financial decisions throughout their life. So at this stage, the real struggle here is when to step in and how. And the primary goal at this stage is, as best as possible, to gain clarity on the illness and what the prognosis might be, right? Because that's going to help a family make decisions about what their loved one's needs are and what the needs are going to be in the near future and potentially in the longer term future. At this stage is also a goal of each caregiver kind of reflecting on their ability to manage their loved one's needs, whether they can take on those roles kind of logistically as well as emotionally taking on those roles. And at this stage, the support that can be helpful, depending on the family dynamics, is, talking with the care recipient and other family members to start thinking about how to maintain independence as long as possible, gain some clarity on their loved ones' kind of goals and wishes for this time in their life, and starting to make kind of a plan together once there is that clarity on what is the illness and what is the prognosis. And certainly we can see that that clarity, it can really vary depending on what kind of medical condition your loved one's dealing with. We know that it can take a while for families to gain clarity on if cognitive impairment is something that is not just temporary, but is more long-term and it's progressing into the stages of dementia. That can take, months to years to get an understanding of that and get a clear diagnosis. And then there can be these questions of like, oh, is this my dad's personality? Is this my dad being depressed? Or is this my dad experiencing dementia? Like, what are these behaviors? Why are they happening? Does he have control over them? So these are all things that come up during this stage of like kind of ambiguous caregiving. And this can be kind of the most confusing stage. Okay, let's see if I can get next slide up here. Oops. Okay, so then we move into what we think of as kind of the middle stages of caregiving. So, So now we're in what we all might think of more when we think of the caregiver, right? At this stage, you understand your loved one's illness and are clearly helping with day-to-day tasks. At this point, the caregiver identifies as being a caregiver because their loved one's needs have gotten to the point where they're needing to assist kind of every day, right? This may look like providing assistance with grocery shopping. It may look like providing assistance with meal planning, managing their finances, and kind of depending on what kind of condition their loved ones managing, it may also look like providing some real kind of self-care assistance, whether that's with bathing, dressing, toileting, those types of daily activities are coming up. And these tasks can really vary by the illness. And what we see in this stage is that as they move through this stage, this kind of simple assistance that might start with just kind of some supervision, oversight on task, really progresses to being more comprehensive assistance as their loved one kind of progresses with the condition that they're dealing with. And at this stage, the caregiver kind of starts to move into this place of being the decision maker in the relationship. And this might vary depending on if you're caring for somebody with cognitive impairment or just more on the physical side of things. But this can be a real transition in the relationship, depending on how decisions were made in the family before. If you're caring for a loved one who's been kind of the decision maker in the family, and you've been the more kind of passive one who accepts their decisions, this can be a real change and transition for a caregiver. Okay. And so when we think about what the struggle is at this stage in caregiving, we might get to the point here as the needs become more comprehensive that the care needs start to exceed what one person can provide, leading to real caregiver burnout if the caregiver is trying to manage their loved one's needs all on their own. And for, this often depends on what other roles the caregiver has in their life, right? We may see often caregivers might still be working, right? They might be working part-time. They might have tried to transition to working from home so that they can maintain some financial support while they're also taking care of their loved one. The caregiver may also have other relationships in their life that require, time and attention. They may be a parent themselves to young children, or have other relationships or responsibilities outside of being a caregiver to their loved one. And so the main goal at this stage is really working on broadening the circle of support for the caregiver and the care recipient. Right? This might look like trying to incorporate or get participation from more family members to provide assistance with things, whether that's having another adult child manage finances who maybe lives out of state but could take on that responsibility. Or it may look like asking family members that live nearby to provide a break for the primary caregiver. Or it may look like, depending on kind of the medical needs or financial abilities of the family, it might look like having a home health aide coming in to provide assistance with bathing or provide assistance with changing or toileting, depending on what those kind of physical needs are. So there's that goal of the caregiver working on broadening that circle of support so that they don't become burned out and start having really significant repercussions in with their own health, physical health or mental health. Because we certainly know that family caregivers, are at risk for putting their own physical health on the back burner. They're at risk for experiencing, anxiety and depression, because this role can become so isolating and intense. The other goal at this stage is for the caregiver to find some meaning and value in this role, because the role is not easy and it's not short often, right? It's not a case of, okay, I'm just gonna, take a break from my other responsibilities for this month and I'm gonna provide this intensive care for my loved one. Sometimes that happens for families, but often we see this caregiving role being much longer, months to years, where they're in this role. And so this can be an important time for the caregiver to know the reason why they're doing it, right? Why are they taking on this role? And it may be that they're doing it because of the care their loved one provided for them, right? Maybe they had, a healthy, stable relationship with this loved one, and they have a very strong value around kind of reciprocating the care that their loved one gave to them. Or it may be if they've had a more difficult or conflicted relationship with the care recipient, they may have a strong value of, setting a model for their own children about how family cares for one another. Um, or they may have a strong value around this is their way to try to repair the relationship with their loved one that they've never been able to have before. And so it is really helpful for the caregiver to have some clarity on, for them personally, why are they doing this? Um, because it's not easy, right? So having that clarity and understanding for themselves of why they're doing it can be really helpful. And then the supports that might be helpful at this stage may be, of course, connecting with friends and family. A lot of caregivers I've worked with at first are very hesitant to really share with friends and family the extent of the caregiving that they're providing. They'll feel like they don't want to burden the people around them. Um, but we know how helpful it can be to be connecting with friends and family. Because when we think about the relationship with the loved one, we know that the care recipient may no longer be able to be engaging in that relationship in the same way. Say it's a spouse caring for a spouse, and that the care recipient has cognitive impairment or a dementia diagnosis, right? The care recipient may no longer be able to be engaging in kind of decisions about finances in the way that they used to, decisions about kind of day-to-day life that the spouse used to turn to them for, or they may not be aware of their own care needs and kind of what's happening for them. And so they might not be expressing appreciation to their loved one who's providing the care. And the caregiver needs to get that may need to get that emotional support outside of the relationship with their loved one, because the loved one might not be able to participate in the relationship in the same way that they have in the past. And so connecting with friends and family to get some of those emotional needs met can be really helpful and important. It might also be a time where it could help the caregiver to connect with other caregivers, whether that's, informally, they have a sister-in-law who was in this role, or they have a friend who was in this role, and getting some support from people who've been through that experience, whether that's informally or participating in like a more structured support group. And then again, kind of depending on the needs of the care recipient and the financial abilities of the family, they might also benefit from having like a paid caregiver coming in to provide support, maybe with some of the more difficult tasks, or just to give the caregiver a break to take care of themselves. So at this stage, it's really that focus on kind of broadening support, bringing in more support into the relationship. Okay, and then as we move on to the next stage, once that stage 3, the care is becoming more comprehensive, their loved ones really needing full support, full complete care assistance. We think of this next stage as kind of transitioning out of that really clear role of day-to-day assistance caregiving, with becoming like the steward or the advocate for their loved one. And we think of this as kind of late stage caregiving, right? Where the needs of their loved one is now at the point of like complete care assistance. And their loved one has a very limited ability to engage in the relationship. Maybe they're losing the ability to communicate effectively. Maybe they're no longer verbally communicating at all. And they're requiring full kind of hands-on care with basic needs and caregiving tasks. And so what we see here is the kind of, depending on the family's decision and abilities to, whether the care continues at home, whether it becomes a situation where the family is no longer able to safely care for their loved one at home and their loved one transitions to like a skilled nursing facility or a memory care unit, right? This stage can look different depending on the care recipient's needs and the family's ability to meet those needs. Um, and the and as the loved one or care recipient transitions into other levels of care, whether that's a long-term care facility, whether there might be hospitalizations at this role, or whether the family makes a decision to transition into palliative or hospice care, the role of the caregiver kind of transitions to being the advocate for their loved one as they navigate these different kind of end of life care, and also the coordinator of that care. So they may be in a situation where they're providing that hands-on care, or they may be in a situation where healthcare professionals are providing that hands-on care, but their role is to advocate for their loved one, make sure their needs are met, make sure they're getting the care and the kind of dignity that they deserve. And so this can be a time, and I have a description here of what one family might experience during this transition. So Sue's the care recipient, and so Sue's oncologist told the family that there's only one other drug to try, and it didn't offer her much chance to survive the cancer. And the family had kind of just been in this role of intervention, and kind of taking that next step in the care. And so the family initially presumes that they should try this medication. And then another one of Sue's providers raises the question of how it would impact, her remaining quality of life and her ability to breathe independently. And Sue was too sedated to participate in the conversation herself. And so the family has the discussions around quality of life, what their loved one's wishes would be, and make that decision to transition care away from kind of intervention-based care into hospice care, where the priority is around quality of life and managing pain. And so the main struggle that we see at this role, at this kind of stage of caregiving, is there can be a lot of anticipatory grief happening, where they are, continue to see aspects of their loved one that they've lost. And it's clear that their loved one is facing end of life. And for the caregiver, they may experience a lot of questioning themselves about what's best for their loved one, questioning themselves about decisions they've made, or kind of how to navigate their loved one's end of life and honor their wishes while also kind of maintaining their safety and meeting their needs. And so at this stage, there's often a lot of emotions happening. And so the goal here is this transition from kind of helping their loved one manage daily life to helping their loved one navigate end of life, and what that's going to look like for them and their family. And so the goal here is to prepare for the caregiver to prepare themselves and their loved one for this transition to end of life care. And so we'll see kind of this simultaneous need to be grieving and also advocating for their loved one. And so supports that can come into play at this stage, I don't have it there, but of course, the support of family and friends in their community. We also often see this as when hospice may come into the picture, depending on kind of the family's wishes, as well as the care recipient's progression through illness. And then depending on the care recipient, the caregiver's relationship with their faith, we might see, spiritual care being an important support at this time. And then, thinking about this next stage after the care recipient's death, it's not something we often think about as part of the caregiving journey. But I think it can be really helpful to think about that transition both into bereavement and then that feeling that transition away from being a caregiver and back into other aspects of the caregiver's life, because that can be a very difficult transition for some people, of course, depending on how long they've been a caregiver, other aspects of their life. But it can be helpful to think about that there are stages of caregiving that exist after their loved one has passed away. So this next stage is characterized by grief, right? The bereavement stage, where the functional needs have certainly shifted away from caring for their loved one, but there can be certainly some real practical matters related to death to be navigating, and sometimes we see that those practical matters fall on the primary caregiver to navigate, the memorial service, what their loved one wants as far as kind of managing the finances and kind of the business aspects around death that can come up at the end of life. But what we also see here sometimes is that here the primary caregiver has been on this journey with their loved one, has been so involved in their loved one's care. And then when they pass away, that the estate, kind of settling the estate, has actually been dedicated to another family member who then kind of steps in and takes care of some of these needs around after the death. And that can be really confusing and difficult for the primary caregiver who's been so involved in their care to kind of step back and have somebody else in the family making decisions. And so at this stage, again, of course, those family dynamics that were there present before becoming a caregiver are also really there during bereavement in families. We certainly can see at times where a family comes together and supports one another around the death of their loved one, but this can also be a time where we can see some conflict in families about how to navigate the memorial service and those types of things, but also, of course, there's a lot of emotion and conflict that can come up around if finances are involved or settling estate and property of a loved one. So the real struggle here is in grief, right? Even if they've been experiencing anticipatory grief for months or years leading up to the death, this experience can really vary for each individual. And the goal here is to, move through grief by acknowledging it and feeling it, and for the caregiver to reflect on memories they had with their loved one, and for them to reflect on the value of their role as caregiver and how they want to view that in their own lives as something that was important role for them to fulfill. And so supports that can be helpful at this stage are connecting with family and friends, and maybe connecting with a spiritual leader if that's in line with their values, or if needed and the grief is really persisting, if it would be helpful to have some grief support or grief counseling. And then there's this last stage that we often don't think about, but this is really the final stage of caregiving, where the caregiver makes that transition away from being a caregiver. and they work on shifting out of that role. And I've heard someone think about it like if we had, say we have like a pie chart, right? And we all have different roles we play in our lives, right? Whether we're, we're a child, we're a parent, we maybe are an employee, we're a small business owner, we're a friend, right? And we're also a caregiver. And during that time of being a caregiver, like that portion of the pie chart that's taken up by being a caregiver can be a lot. And so when our loved one dies, we're losing the role of being a caregiver, and we're also potentially losing the role of having a parent, or we're losing the role of a spouse. We're no longer a wife, we're no longer a daughter to that child, to that parent. And so there can be a real void there. Both kind of an emotional void, but also like how am I going to fill my time void feeling when being a caregiver might have taken so much time for several years there. But there really can be, a full range of emotions during this time. There can be relief, that their loved ones no longer suffering, relief that they're no longer in that really complex, difficult role of being a caregiver. And there can be a lot of sadness. There can be a lot, right? And this is a time that people are still grieving, maybe grieving the loss of opportunities that they had during that time of being a caregiver. And so the goal here is working on re-engaging in their life, right? Re-establishing that pie chart of other roles in their lives, other relationships or responsibilities, and reconnecting with activities and relationships that are meaningful. I've had the opportunity to work with some caregivers from that like ambiguous caregiver stage, all the way to this rebuilding stage. And some people are able to navigate this more easily than others, depending on, are they still in the community where they lived a long time and they have some long-term relationships that they can return to? Or did they move to live closer to family, and now they're kind of struggling to make relationships at that stage in their life? So this part can look very different for each caregiver. Okay. And so when we're thinking about these caregiving roles, whether we're a caregiver ourselves or whether we work with caregivers in our professional role, or we have family or friends who are in caregiving roles, it can be helpful for them to reflect on kind of what stage they're in, and what supports are available and what the future might look like. Because we know that when caregivers are able to utilize supports, hopefully if they're there, I certainly understand that sometimes there are resources or there's logistics around having extra support, but when they're able to utilize supports throughout, and when they're able to kind of navigate and work through some of the emotional challenges that come up in caregiving, we know that they're less likely to experience more complex grief after. They're less likely to experience more of some mental health challenges that can come up for caregivers. And they're going to be able to move through those transitions a little bit more easily when they're utilizing support, when they're kind of allowing emotions to come up, when they're working through some of those things. And that's kind of the end. So we've worked through all of the roles. Any thoughts or questions from anyone there around, or ideas of other supports people might be able to access at these different stages?
Claire, this is Judy. I've never seen stage 5 and 6 before in any presentation I've ever watched, or any group I've ever been a part of. Thank you for including that, because I think that's because oftentimes when you are a caregiver, you end up you have this whole new support system for you as well as for the person you're taking care of. And
Right.
then when they go, you feel
Right.
like I'm all at once really alone,
Very alone. It can
very
be.
alone. And so that I'm really appreciated the just one mentioning it, and then also mentioning the whole mental health component of that,
Mhm.
because you have to revamp your whole life around something different now. So you have like
Right.
two losses: the loss of the person and the loss of those other caregivers or your support system to keep you going during the caregiver phase. Because apparently
Mhm.
people think when somebody dies, you don't need them anymore.
Right. Exactly. Right. You might have built up a community that had been really helpful, but then you no longer fit in that community, or it feels like you no longer fit. And you
Yeah.
may also experience a loss of purpose. When you're caring for somebody, especially at end of life, it's so intense. It takes so much emotional and physical time. And then like it's gone. Right. And you're like, what is
Yeah.
my purpose? How do I spend my time? And I don't know if you all have experienced this. I had some caregivers who are interested and able to think about life after their loved one passes away, and other caregivers who really emotionally don't feel comfortable talking about that or thinking about it, or feel like guilt or shame or thinking about what their life might be after their loved one dies.
Well, exactly. And I know, like, when we've done the caregiver conference in the past, a few people who had lost their person from one conference to the next when we were doing them yearly, and in person, they were like, can I still come? Because I made so many good friends and I just need to know how to pick up from where I'm at now to go
Yeah.
forward. Because there aren't really like support. I don't know what your support group is, but other support groups kind of like help you until they die. And then
Right.
it's like, bye-bye.
Right. And then like the caregiver also has like obtained all of this knowledge that they didn't necessarily want, but like they have obtained all of this knowledge
Yes.
about how to care for somebody. And then it's like, and then am I not even going to use that knowledge anymore or share it? Or, who am I?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So really, really helpful to kind of, well, and actually to do the whole pre is the
Yeah.
other thing. Because I think most of us don't, even though you might, like I did not know that I would be a caregiver for my grandmother, her twin sister, my mother, my father, my sisters. So it's like, you think, okay, you've got time, and all it takes is one medical diagnosis to change all of that.
Right. Right.
And then
then
the other thing I think that you mentioned that's really good is that for a lot of us, you can deal with some stuff, but if everything happens around the same time, it's like, how much can you really process?
Yeah. And then of course you have your own relationship with each of those family members. Right.
As an added
And
bonus, right?
has an added bonus, right? Like, and it might be a great relationship, or there might be some real stresses or challenges. And suddenly, you're caring for somebody that you didn't never had a really healthy relationship with. And maybe there's a lot of grief around that parent never being able to be the parent you needed. And now that's not going to happen. And now you're caring for them.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
I just think it's, this is always really close to my heart with the caregiving, but I just see people really, really struggling. Especially they're struggling during the caregiving because they don't think they're doing enough.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, they'll have guilt about not feeling like they did enough. And then they don't know how to pick up and move forward easily.
Right.
And I think, at least for me, the times where I've been a caregiver and we brought hospice in near the end, it has worked better. Because the hospice community, they're there for the person, but honest to God, they're really there for the family.
They're really there to help.
They're really
family.
to help us get through it, and to know what to look for. And then also to kind of, you could do some of that grieving while they're still here. And let you kind of move forward faster. But for a lot of folks who don't it comes too quickly or the hospice wasn't an option. I think
Yeah,
it's
or
much
we see
harder.
them like transition to hospice when there's 2 days left,
Oh,
right?
yes.
Like
Oh,
you're like, we needed 6 months, we needed the full hospice benefit with like people coming into the home, the social worker support, the chaplain support, the pain management,
the whole
right?
pain management is so big because
Yeah,
without the hospice, people will think that your doctor thinks you're somehow, they're in the process of dying, but somehow we're going to get them addicted.
right.
You don't want to get them addicted. I'm like, they're dying.
Like they're dying,
I would much
right?
prefer they be out of pain and not yelling and screaming. I want
Right.
them to have a quality of life, not a quantity.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
sometimes the providers are very afraid that somehow they will be held somehow responsible.
Right, right.
But hospice doesn't think that way. Hospice
Okay.
has a whole, and that mindset is lovely to work with.
Yeah.
I feel like
It's
I'm dominating.
it's such a
Sorry.
different mind frame though, but I think that's really important to notice, right? That like so often providers are focused on intervention because that's what they do, right? Like doctors, healthcare providers like want to intervene and treat. And sometimes there isn't a discussion early enough around what are we treating? What is this going to look like? What are our wishes? How do we want this to end?
Like I have my younger sister refused to be told what was really happening. Didn't want to know what her stage 4 did not. I don't want to know what stage I'm in. And so the rest of us all knew, but she did not. So it's like, and she kept going for chemo and radiation treatments. And I'm like, why in the frig are we doing this to her?
Right.
She's not, because there comes a point where it's not working. And it's like that, we would like to be able to take her on a trip. She wanted to see her nieces and nephews, but
Yeah.
she's so exhausted, we can't get her there because you're doing these treatments. And it's like, in some regards, I truly felt like the medical system was like, hey, but I can get money reimbursement for these treatments. And, let's just rack it on up, honey.
Right. Like, what are we doing?
And I'm like, finally, I just had to say to my sister, Babs, you don't know what's going on, but I'm seeing you're not getting, it's not helping you at this point. I know you want to hang on. I get that. And we've let you go as long as possible, but we're to the point where if you have to decide how you want to spend your time and what you want to do during that time. And it's short. So let's map it out. And it was too short.
Yeah.
For her to do everything she wanted to, but we got some of it done. But I just felt like her providers were really not with the program.
Talking about it.
No, they wouldn't. No, because she had told them, I don't want to know. And so they have this big note in the file. She doesn't want to know. Call Judy with all the updates. And I'm like,
call Judy. Yeah.
Thanks ever so much. I said, this is not, it's not fit. It wasn't fair for Barbara to put me in the position. It certainly was not helpful. And I think sometimes, but to be honest with you, our oncologist didn't want to have the discussion.
Yeah, and oftentimes they're not.
She goes, I
they're
got
not
a person who wants to fight. I want her to fight. I'm like,
yeah.
Yeah. So sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts or roles that we missed here? Okay, well, the only other thing I have on here is just, that there's a couple more, talks coming up in the caregiver support series over the next 2 months that look great. And that I do run a support group for Alzheimer's and dementia caregivers. And it's on the 3rd Thursday of each month. So our next one is next week on the 20th over at the Basalt Library, and that's free. And always welcome people to join. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Of course.
That was amazing. I
you.
appreciated the early stages as well as the late ones. That was really
I know
helpful.
it made me be like, is there things I need to, I'm like, I should be working on things in my own family around how we communicate, things that haven't been resolved, right? Because that stuff's going to come up left and right if I become a caregiver at their end of life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, similar
Yeah.
notes. So thank you.
Yeah, it's like personal notes. Fix family. Okay.
Yeah. That's Wednesday.
Good luck with
Exactly.
that one.
Yeah, I know. Take care of myself, fix
That's
family, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, certainly encourage anyone to reach out if they have any other questions or, I'm here. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Yep.
you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.